The summer of 1940, and Britain stands alone. Hitler's victorious armies have swept through Europe with remarkable speed. The irresistible power of blitzkrieg, a new, modern form of warfare, appears invincible, trailing mayhem and devastation in its wake, bringing Hitler within sight of the next step in his quest for global domination, the stubborn little island of Great Britain. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain, should commence immediately. But first, the German Air Force must gain control of the skies over southern England and the Channel. A simple task for Göring's magnificent Luftwaffe, Hitler believes. Yet he has not reckoned with the stubborn resistance that the Luftwaffe will encounter, the dogged determination and fierce spirit of the pilots and ground crews of Fighter Command. If Hitler is to realize his greatest desire, then he must first join battle with the few. This is the story of that momentous summer, the true story of the Battle of Britain. It is also the story of one of those squadrons of brave young men who were sent to meet the might of the Luftwaffe head-on. This is the true story of RAF Fighter Squadron 501.
You know what I mean? A good turnout. It's the 501 standard, actually. Survivors, everyone.
501 Squadron were the only squadron which was on station in the Battle of Britain area from day one to the end, having already been through the Battle of France.
Continually on up from May 1940 until December.
We lost more airplanes, pilots killed or wounded, than any other single squadron.
501 Squadron was originally formed in 1929 as a special reserve squadron of the RAF, its home base Filton in Gloucestershire. With the appearance of the Nazi threat on the continent, the RAF designated 501 as a squadron of the Auxiliary Air Force. At the same time, the government decided to create a volunteer reserve, which would give civilians an opportunity to learn to fly at the taxpayers' expense. Many of the future members of 501 Squadron began their flying careers with the VR.
I saw an advertisement in the newspaper saying that they were going to start a reserve where you could fly in your spare time while you were still at work. I applied and fortunately became the fourth person to be accepted.
A lot of young people in those days, we looked for something, and they enabled us to fly without having to pay for it, which was something important as far as I was concerned, because I was an engineering apprentice, and obviously I needed some support from my parents.
With events escalating out of control on mainland Europe, the regular and auxiliary squadrons were brought up to their wartime establishment.
As a regular in the Air Force before the war, I started flying in 1938. I had an uncle who was a military man in the First World War, and at about 36-7, he said, there's going to be a war, and the Air Force is a thing for you. And he said, if you get in now, stand half a chance of being well trained by the time the war starts.
Well, I joined the Auxiliary Air Force in '36 and had an airplane with another leading aircraftsman. I looked after the engine, he looked after everything else. And after Munich, towards the end of '38, he left the squadron to join the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve to train to be a pilot. I went to the CO and said I would like to follow suit, and he said, wouldn't you rather stay with the squadron and fly? And I said, yes, but that's only for commissioned officers. He said, well, in confidence I can tell you that I'm getting an establishment of 6 NCO pilots. Would you not rather stay with the squadron and learn to fly? I said I would, and I did.
On the 1st of December 1938, 501 was converted from a bomber to a fighter squadron. With Europe about to plunge into chaos, the pilots of 501 would soon find themselves in the front lines of the conflict, looking boldly to their squadron's motto for inspiration: Nil timere, fear nothing. In the small hours of September the 1st, 1939, the first German troops moved into Poland. 2 days later, as Warsaw experienced another day of continuous bombing, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain finally declared war on Nazi Germany. 501 was fully mobilised, and already its Hurricanes were carrying out patrols over the British Channel. Sergeant Pilot Ken Lee was a new face at the squadron.
501 Squadron needed reinforcements because they only had about 12 pilots who were wartime experienced with about 5 hours each on Hurricanes. So they sent myself and several other people who've been doing this voluntary peacetime squadron flying to back up 501 Squadron, bringing about 100 hours experience each to the squadron.
The phony war supervened, however, and an anxious British public, who at first believed the bombs would rain down post-haste, began to believe that they may never come at all. On the 10th of May 1940, the Germans invaded Belgium, Holland and the northeast of France. Their aim, the River Meuse. The Great Blitzkrieg had begun. Within hours, 501 Squadron was on its way to France. Already landed at the forward base in Bethineville, pilot officer Peter Hares looked on as one of 501's Bombay aircraft transports that was carrying the squadron's rear party came in to land.
Its nose rose and it just sort of stalled from about 100 feet, 150 feet maybe just dropped onto the ground, broke its back, and we lost 3 of our members. They were our first casualties.
501 had quickly come to know the grim realities of war, and it was not long before the pilots saw their first action.
I think the following day, May the 12th, we'd gone up on patrol. We came across a Dornier 17, I think it was. We all went in and we all pumped things into it. And we landed and went into breakfast, and the rear gunner from this German aircraft was looking not very happy with himself, having a cup of coffee, lying on a couch.
Of course, the first time we ever saw a formation of 35 enemy aircraft, after we'd been practicing for over a year, one way or another, on imitation targets, that was a real thrill to see them at last. We were flying on a patrol. On the ground, I saw bomb bursts, and I traced these bomb bursts to a formation of Dorniers, which were bombing targets of opportunity. So when I got in position to fire behind this formation, I looked round for my support and no one was there. But by this time I was fully committed and I had to go on in and got one of them confirmed by the French artillery, and another one went down smoking, and they got 37 hits on me. Well, of course, I was delighted to have a major victory right away, only 3 days after rising in France, and went back to the squadron delighted with myself until they told me how badly my aircraft was damaged. It had to be put out of service.
Hitler's panzer divisions were moving through France at a rate of 40 miles in a single day. The push into the Ardennes had taken the Allied forces completely by surprise. Continually outmaneuvered, the French army and the troops of the British Expeditionary Force seemed incapable of building upon any successful offensive of their own. Against this background, the pilots of 501 had to maintain dawn-till-dusk patrols of the front lines of battle.
France was a rather difficult place to fly around in because we didn't know the countryside all that well.
It was all targets of opportunity. You see, we had no radar, there was no ground control. They weren't able to vector us onto targets. We had to go out and patrol in likely spots and hope to intercept somebody.
By the 15th of May, the German forces had reached their target of the River Meuse. Enormous pressure was building for the Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, to send more fighters to France in order to resist the German advance. However, He argued that no further fighter squadrons should be sent, believing that the total force needed for a successful defence of Britain against the Luftwaffe would be 52 squadrons. And therefore, Dowding insisted, any fighters sent to France should be regarded as an overseas force, separate from that number. His precious 52 squadrons had already been reduced to 36, and at the present rate at which his planes were being shot down in the futile campaign over France, there would be none left at all within 2 weeks. Nevertheless, at the urging of the French, Churchill authorised the sending of 4 more squadrons. Predictably, this did nothing to stem the irresistible Nazi tide, and the inevitable process of retreat that would conclude with the evacuation of Dunkirk was already underway.
We were never over the beaches of Dunkirk. We were in the hinterland, trying to intercept these raids coming in before they got to Dunkirk, not knowing, not being told anything about Dunkirk itself.
By the 4th of June, the evacuation of Dunkirk was complete, but for the pilots of 501, there was no respite. They were needed to provide a rearguard action, enabling the remains of the British Army to escape from other ports along the French coast. On occasion, the pilots were so tired that they had to be lifted from their cockpits. On the 17th, France approached Germany for what they called honourable peace terms, and finally, the next day, after darkness had fallen, an exhausted 501 squadron was able to leave for England.
We'd lost several pilots. When we got back to England, we reformed at Croydon, got new aircraft, and we were just as ready to go as we'd been beforehand.
Dowding had been correct to question the assignment of fighters to France. Of the 261 Hurricanes that were sent as support to the British Army, only 66 returned to England. Now he turned his attention to the inevitable onslaught of the Luftwaffe. Dowding had divided Britain into 4 fighter groups. Number 12 group he had given to perhaps his fiercest critic, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory. His friend and close colleague, Air Commodore Keith Park, would command the strategically vital 11 Group. The fighter squadrons here would inevitably face the brunt of the attack. 501 was initially placed in the thick of it at Middle Wallop, near Andover. Dowding surveyed all from Fighter Command HQ at Bentley Priory. He was not only Commander-in-Chief of the fighter squadrons, but also of the whole control network that fed these squadrons with the information they needed to successfully engage the enemy. This included the radar stations. Radar was a new, hastily developed technology that would prove vital to Fighter Command's war effort. It was used to determine the location, height and strength of enemy aircraft as they crossed the Channel and approached the coastline of southeast England.
The control from the ground with these operations room run by the WAFs were excellent. They were very accurate in the height and speed and numbers of the enemy aircraft, so that we were able to organize our formations to the best of advantage.
Without the radar and the fighter control, we wouldn't have been able to fight the way we did, because we'd have to either have had standing patrols in the air, which would have been very, very wasteful, or we'd have had to search for them, actually. And of course, that would have been equally wasteful.
Once past the coast, it was left to the Observer Corps to track the course of the raiders, using only binoculars, a simple sighting device, and an aircraft recognition booklet. Little wonder that Churchill likened this to going from the middle of the 20th century to the early Stone Age. This command network would be making the crucial decisions of the war: when to send planes into battle, where to engage the enemy, and with how many fighters, ultimately determining whether the battle would be won or lost.
10 aircraft.
Across the Channel, the gathering forces of the German Air Force could not have been under the control of a man more different from the taciturn Dowding. Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, chief of the Luftwaffe, was a brash and willful man. A World War I fighter ace, his spectacular rise through the Nazi ranks had brought him untold riches and gained him the position of one of Hitler's closest confidants. Now, his beloved Luftwaffe was given a very specific task: to reduce the RAF to such a state that it would be unable to mount any significant resistance to a Nazi invasion force. As the two sides prepared to engage in the first sorties of the Battle of Britain, Fighter Command had 609 single-engine fighters at its disposal, only 531 of which were actually serviceable and ready to fly. The total fighter force of the Luftwaffe was somewhat larger, at 809 Messerschmitt Bf 109s, but the French campaign meant that only 656 could be called upon immediately. The Luftwaffe's bombing force was somewhat more impressive. 769 twin-engine bombers, mostly Heinkel 111s, could be expected to send their bomb loads crashing down on strategic targets. And these were complemented by 248 Junkers 87s, the terrifying Stuka dive bomber that had caused so much devastation over Dunkirk, and 168 of the much maligned but nevertheless effective Messerschmitt Bf 110s. The scene was set. Shelling of the English coastline had already begun. Now Goering launched his bombers upon the shipping convoys with the intention of closing the channel to all British naval traffic. The Germans met with instant success. This action had the additional benefit of drawing the British fighters into the air to protect the convoys. Dowding was afraid that to effectively protect shipping, he would have to commit a dangerously high proportion of his total force. But as more and more shipping was lost, pressure from the Admiralty and the Air Ministry came to bear, and the Hurricanes and Spitfires of Fighter Command were sent to intercept the enemy for the first time.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, for about 10 German machines dive bombing the British convoy, which is just out to sea in the Channel. I can't see anything. No, we thought he got a German one had been got then, but now the British fighters are coming up.
By the 19th of July, losses were already such that within 6 weeks, Fighter Command would cease to exist.
And here they come in absolute steep dive, and you can see their bombs actually leave the machines and come into the water.
On the 25th, 501 Squadron was moved to Gravesend, forming part of the Biggin Hill Wing. Its pilots were flying increasingly hazardous shipping patrols virtually every day.
A force of Stukas attacked Dover Harbour, and we intercepted them as they put their noses down to dive and bomb the installations. So we followed them down. At the same time, the harbour defences opened up, so we were shooting at the Stukas and they were shooting back at us, and the harbour defences were shooting at everybody else. So it was a complete melee there. I got a Stuka over the entrance of the harbour, which was apparently seen from the shore, and then I had to pull away because the Stuka behind was shooting at me. And that was probably the most intense engagement I had.
By this time, Hitler had issued the top-secret Directive No. 16, only 7 copies of which were ever made. It ordered the preparations for a landing operation against England to begin immediately. In many ways, July was a month of experiments. The destruction of shipping was costly in terms of raw materials and lives, but the real value of these raids was in what both sides were beginning to learn about each other. the Luftwaffe probed the British defences, discovering response times and looking for weaknesses, while the British bedded down their radar system, learning to interpret the little green blips that would appear on the cathode ray tubes in order to effectively dispatch their fighters to engage the enemy. The fighter pilots were also sounding each other out, looking for the strengths and weaknesses in the performance of enemy aircraft while seeking to get the best out of their own machines, changing and refining tactics, striving for the upper hand. The Hurricane, which the members of 501 Squadron flew with such enthusiasm, was a monoplane version of the Hawker Fury. Initially, designer Sidney Cam undertook its development as a private venture, fully supported by Hawkers, but contrary to Air Ministry specification. Its old-fashioned wood and fabric makeup, stiffened by a metal tube framework, meant that it was a kind of halfway home between the biplanes of the First World War and the new Spitfire.
It was a damn fine aircraft. It was very strong. It was easy to fly.
It would take a good old battering, and also it was very much more easily repaired because it was a canvas structure, wings and body, and could be repaired quite readily, whereas if a Spitfire was hit, then it was a metal worker's job and a long job.
The Hurricane was a good, solid, shall we say, workhorse, that's the way to put it, whereas the Spitfire was a thoroughbred racing horse.
The key to the Spitfire's excellence was its distinctive curved wings. A design way ahead of its time, it looked more like a racer than a military plane. When told his machine had been given the name Spitfire, designer Reginald Mitchell complained that it was just the sort of bloody silly name they would choose. The Luftwaffe's single-engine fighter was the Bf 109. Its designer, Willy Messerschmitt, had no engine that could compare to the Rolls-Royce Merlin utilised by the Hurricanes and Spitfires. So he designed the smallest, lightest and most aerodynamic airframe that could fit around the available Jumo engine. By the start of the battle, its performance was probably marginally better than the Hurricane and as good as the Spitfire. The pilots who were actually flying these machines were making their own comparisons, however.
The only snag was the Hurricanes couldn't operate at the height of the 109, and the Spitfire could operate higher than we could. That's why, generally speaking, the Spitfires were set off to deal with the 109s and the fighter aircraft above the bombers, and we were sent into the bombers. Didn't always work out that way, mind you.
It hadn't got the speed of a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt 109, but we could outturn the 109s, no problem there.
The Hurricane was more manoeuvrable. It would turn inside either a Spitfire, which it didn't have to, but more important, inside a 109. And if you could turn inside it, you ended up on its tail.
Turning a tight curve was perhaps the greatest test of a pilot's skill. It has also been the subject of much controversy between the pilots of different aircraft ever since the battle. Theoretically, the 109 could execute the tightest turn, but in reality it was often the pilot who best knew the limits of his plane and who would be most prepared to push them who would gain the advantage over his adversary. Pilot Officer Gordon Parkin remembers vividly the origin of his respect for the Hurricane's turning ability.
On one occasion, I got out of a very awkward situation shooting at this 109. I looked quickly at the mirror and I saw another one right on my tail. I did a very, very tight turn to the left and the other fellow couldn't follow me. And I think if I hadn't taken action immediately, I'd have been blown out of the sky, because they had a vicious little cannon which fired through the propeller boss. And if you got hit with one of those, you hadn't much chance.
Well, the Hurricane had eight Browning machine guns.
They all fired at the same time, and you couldn't sort of select. And you just had a firing button on your control column. And you just pressed that and the guns fired.
A 3-second burst is quite a long one, and I think that my recollection is that we had about 15 seconds, but then you'd only go brrrt, like that was 1 second.
All 8 guns went through a circle of about 1 metre at 250 yards. So if you were accurate in your shooting, you had a very powerful hitting power.
It depended on where you hit him. If you hit the actual pilot, poof, that was it. If you hit the engine, and their engines were very strong actually and very hard, but if you hit them in the radiator, then they would slow up, and you could then get closer, and he had to then try and fight his way out and get back. Otherwise he came down in the UK, and that was the end of the war.
On the 31st of July, Pilot Officer Parkin had had trouble starting his Hurricane for the return to base from 501's forward station of Hawk End. Having finally become airborne, he cautiously approached the blacked-out airfield at Gravesend as dusk was falling.
I could see the boundaries of the airfield fairly clearly, but it got worse as I got down. I saw the boundary go underneath, and I was breathing a sigh of relief, but it was rather short-lived because the next moment I saw 3 rows of barbed wire come up the landing beam at me. I tried to avoid it by opening the throttle quickly, but it was too late. The wheels caught this wire. Next thing I remember, I was upside down, and it had gone completely over, and the cockpit was filling up with earth, because we always landed with the canopy back. It was a regulation, we had to. And I passed out then, and about 48 hours later woke up in Gravesend Hospital. And my parents standing at the bedside. And as I say, that put me out of the battle for the rest of the Battle of Britain, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I don't know which. I'd either have been killed later or been an ace like some of the others.
By now, the strain upon Fighter Command's manpower was becoming immense. While Lord Beaverbrook's unorthodox methods at the Ministry of Aircraft Production meant that the fighter squadrons would eventually enjoy a continuous supply of aircraft, the shortfall in trained pilots was far more worrying. On August the 10th, Dowding was forced to cut the operational training period for fighter pilots to just 2 weeks. Until July, this same course had lasted 6 months. Bill Green was one of the many new recruits to experience a whirlwind training.
I hadn't fired any guns, I hadn't used radio, hadn't used oxygen, hadn't used a VPS crew. I went down to the training flight to this pilot officer Flinders, and he said, well, now, you were a fitter, weren't you, before you were a pilot? I said, yes. He said, what airplanes did you have? I said, well, we just got Hurricanes when I converted. Oh, well, then he said, you know all about them. There's one over there. He said, go and sit in it, and when you feel comfortable, just take it off. I said, well, hang about. I said, I need to know what speed it lifts off at and what speed it comes in at and what speed I need for a loop. And so he told me, and off I went, and that was really, I was a self-starter. I had to find out the hard way from scratch.
I received no fighter training whatsoever. The first time I saw a Hurricane was when I arrived at Biggin Hill in July of 1940, and I was shown a Hurricane fighter. We flew the Hurricane in the afternoon for a very short period, about an hour or so around the aerodrome at Biggin Hill, and then the next morning we were flying on operations.
I said, I don't know whether it matters, sir, but I've never fired the guns on one of these aircraft yet. And he said, oh, haven't you, old boy? He said, well, you see that big cloud up there? I said, yes. He said, well, go and see if you can hit that.
In the middle of my sleep, in the dark, somebody was shaking me with a shining a light in my face. I said, what's going on? He said, come on, get up. I said, no. I said, I'm just arrived. I'm green. He said, yes, you're green 3. And in a matter of minutes after that, Lacey and I were walking towards our airplane just before dawn to go down to our forward base at Hawk End. And I said to Ginger, well, what's this green section? What's green 3? He said, well, we're the Arsene Charlie section. He said, when we get up a bit, he said, we have to start weaving at the back of the squadron to make sure that we're not bounced from behind. So he said, when you see me do a turn to the right, he said, do one to the left. But don't overdo it, he said, otherwise, he said, you'll lose the squadron. Well, I did it, when I saw him go, I did the gentlest turn and the shortest turn of all time before I turned back and everyone had gone. The sky was empty. I was very ill-equipped to fly in combat, and the results proved it. Most of the senior people, they had been through the Battle of France, and they were experienced pilots who knew all about it and had a lot of experience before the Battle of France. And as a consequence, during the Battle of Britain, they were carrying the full weight of the battle, because people like me were joining and were being shot out of the sky in seconds because we just didn't know what it was all about.
Soon, it would seem as if July had been a month of mere skirmishes. On August the 12th, the Germans, with a series of carefully planned and remarkably successful attacks on radar stations, tore a 100-mile gap in Fighter Command's radar chain. It must have seemed to Goering and his generals as the perfect preparation for Eagle Day, the massive assault that was planned for the following day. But by that evening, most of the radar stations along the English coast had been hastily patched up. Only the station at Ventnor remained down. Cannily, its signal was transmitted by another station, fooling the Germans into believing that it too had remained operational. The 13th of August. With Goering's enormous offensive Eagle attack, the Luftwaffe mounted its greatest effort so far, its whole might being brought to bear upon Fighter Command for the first time. It began inauspiciously when poor weather caused Goering to issue a postponement, but the order failed to reach certain units, and by mid-afternoon, masses of German aircraft descended upon a variety of strategic targets. As the battles raged across the southeast of England, these great adversaries exchanged blow after blow. Both air forces were now irreversibly locked in battle.
We all swore that we'd never have a telephone after the war.
You're sitting there knowing that the telephone is going to ring. It's likely if it rings that it's a scramble.
The word would be shouted 501 scramble, and we'd all rush out to our aircraft, which was sitting there at readiness.
We had our parachutes hanging over the wing, so we could pull them on quickly. In, start up.
Scrambled off in threes, forming up off the aerodrome into a squadron of, if we could get 12 aircraft in the air, which was very rare.
We could, in fact, from tents, sitting round Hawkins, get the squadron in the air in 1.5 minutes.
We were told to look out for 200 snappers, and there were just 12 of us.
You imagine that your little squadron, 12 aircraft, is going to have to take on 50, 100 aircraft.
And we were vectored onto the bomber stream as they came in with the ME-109s covering them.
And then the dogfight would start, and they were in all directions.
You're looking through 360 degrees the whole time.
Diving, turning and twisting.
Trying to get into position to shoot him down, stop him getting into position to shoot you down.
Closed your eyes and pressed the button.
With any luck, you found yourself on the tail of something.
It's just a question of endurance and strength to get to hold the aircraft and get round tighter than he can.
But often we had to fight our way in and fight our way out.
It got very quickly to be every man for himself.
We used to say, if you see a little cloud up there, point your 8 machine guns at it and press the button, and out will come in all directions, Hurricanes and Spitfires.
You would make sure that you got him and he didn't get you. I mean, that was it.
Great unawareness of anything else, even to be frightened. I mean, you were too occupied to realize that you were.
As the smoke settled on Eagle Day, the Germans had mounted 1,485 sorties. Fighter Command had responded with a nicely anticipated 700. Evidently, the RAF sector controllers were learning fast when to send their fighters into battle. Ultimately, Goering had assigned no priority to the targets of that day. Was the Luftwaffe supposed to destroy Fighter Command by bombing it on the ground or by forcing its fighters to battle in the air? One way or another, the Luftwaffe did have to destroy Fighter Command. Fighter Command, on the other hand, just needed to remain intact as a fighting force until the weather became too bad for an invasion attempt. Of course, this would be easier said than done, and on the 18th of August, 501 Squadron experienced its most testing day of the campaign so far.
The main disaster we ever had when 501 lost 4 aircraft in one sortie was probably one of the few times I didn't do the rear cover. I was actually in charge of the squadron on that particular day, and because we were only going back on a practice flight, I put 2 new boys behind the squadron to practice their rear cover, which they'd never done before, and I myself was flying in the middle of the formation. And we got jumped completely. This German came down, Oberleutnant Schopfel. He shot the 2 individual weavers and another man in the rear, and then myself. And he said that my aircraft blew up and with so much debris he had to pull away, otherwise he'd been able to get more of the squadron. But I got a bullet in my leg, which threw my leg into the air. And then I tried to get out, and the wind blew me back in again. And eventually I got out at 17,000 feet, so I did a free fall drop down to 10,000 feet before I pulled the parachute to keep out of the air battle or being shot on my parachute.
6 Hurricanes were lost on that black day for 501 Squadron, with 2 pilots killed and a further 3, including Ken Lee, in hospital with serious injuries. Over the course of the next week, the German air fleets continued to test the strength of Fighter Command by launching simultaneous attacks from all sides. However, on the 15th of August, Goering had declared that it was doubtful whether attacks on radar sites were successful. It was his first major error. Now, the attacks on the fighter airfields began. Fighter Command came to regard this as the critical period. For the first time, the squadron ground crews and the airfield staff were brought into the front line of battle. Biggin Hill Airfield suffered a devastating low-level attack on the 30th of August, leaving 39 dead and 26 injured. The Luftwaffe seemed to do no wrong. In the 2 weeks of this critical period, Fighter Command lost 200 more planes than it managed to shoot down. Many of these losses came on the ground, as the Germans launched wave after wave of raids on sector airfields, 6 out of 7 of which were critically damaged. 231 pilots were killed, wounded, or missing. Goering was close to achieving the air superiority the invasion needed. Bill Green had already been shot down on the 24th, and on the 29th he was to be put out of the battle for good.
We were vectored over Deal, and suddenly a hole appeared in this so-called bulletproof windscreen, and the airplane was finished. It was shot to pieces. I got as far as pulling the pin of the Sutton harness and taking the weight off my feet, having the hood back, and I was sucked out. And immediately my flying boots went past my ear, psst, psst, like that. And I thought, my God, I'll never find this ripcord, but I did. I was rolling, and I pulled it, and I saw a piece of white twice do 2 eccentric circles. And this didn't have any significance until the main canopy fell from its pack, because what I had seen was in fact the pilot parachute, and the main canopy, having nothing to pull it from its pack, fell from its pack, and I rolled into it. So I could see nothing, but I knew that it didn't have to come up through my legs, it had to go up behind me. So I was busily doing a sort of breaststroke, trying to push it back through my legs, which was quite forlorn, really. I really thought that it was my end. And I reckoned I was about 16,000 feet when I pulled the cord, I'm guessing, but we were at 20,000 feet when I was hit. And suddenly there was a jolt when I was kicked backwards. I think the wind must have got under one of the parachute folds. And a secondary jolt when the rigging lines, which are up and down your back, ripped away from their fasteners, and I grabbed them thinking, having seen one bit go and experienced the consequences, I thought the whole lot might be going. And the thing I remember most of all at that moment was the quietude, which hit me more than any noise I'd ever heard. And I realized that I was okay. And I looked to my right and there were pylon cables level with me. And I looked to my left and there were trees above me. So I realized I was near the ground, and the only thing I'd learned about parachute jumping was that if you hit the ground you had to relax your knees, which I did instantly, and bang, I was down.
Bill Green's 7 days of action had seen him fly 28 sorties, but the tired pilots of Fighter Command were now losing their comrades at a faster rate than they could be replaced. The gravity of the situation was brought home to Sergeant Pilot Tony Pickering in a very graphic way.
We were billeted in a house on the outskirts of the aerodrome, and there were 4 of us sleeping in the room. And then one night, one fella was shot down, or in the daytime actually. There was only 3. The next night there was only 2. The next night I was there by myself, and the next day I jumped out. So it was a remarkable coincidence that we went down from 4, 3, 2, 1, and then I jumped out.
One got used to the fact that one day people would be missing that were there with you the day before, and you expected it, you know. I mean, it was a real live war, and people were dying, and it might be you and it was them, and you were thankful that it was not you, but sorry that it was them.
Despite the seemingly forlorn situation Fighter Command now found itself in, morale within the squadrons remained high. The young pilots even found ways in which to relax and leave the troubles of the day's fighting behind. Pilot officer Vivian Snell had already gained a reputation as 501's tame Fats Waller for his performances at the mess piano.
Yes, well, I mean, we were close enough to South Croydon. My flight commander and I had a couple of girls there. They used to visit most evenings. We used to get into our best blue and pop it. I had a car. We'd drive in there and come back just before dawn when we were on readiness again. I don't know if I can tell you this, but I had a bit of a problem with mine after time. Things hadn't arrived which she thought ought to. And I went to the squadron MO and asked him if he could help. He said, no, there's nothing we can do for a civilian, but he said, let's find out if what you're describing is, or she's describing. And he said, get me a sample. So I took an empty half bottle, whiskey bottle in, which he filled. And things were a bit tense, so on the way back to Kenley, I stopped at a pub, went in for a couple of drinks, and of course the population couldn't get whiskey for love nor money. When I came out, somebody had stolen a bottle.
And I'll say one thing now I've never been able to understand, and that was very rarely were we called to intercept or defend the country in the evenings. I would say about 6 o'clock in the evening was the last raids. I always thought, and I still think today, that the German Air Force played it very fair. They wanted to get back and enjoy their evenings with their local girls in the cafes and restaurants in France, and they enabled us to do the same.
We go down to central London and go to 1 or 2 clubs there for an hour or 2, but in the evenings we were usually too tired to do much, and certainly in August and September, by the time we were released at last light, it was 10 to 10 and the pubs closed at 10, so we couldn't do much in the way of going out and having a good time.
Although the position for Fighter Command seemed dire, the balance of the battle was in fact beginning to shift in its favour. Dowding's policy of seeking out bombers whilst trying to avoid the fighters was eating away at the confidence of the German bomber crews, and for their part, the 109 pilots were aggrieved that the RAF fighters were not engaging them. On the 30th of August, Fighter Command had flown 1,000 sorties in a single day for the first time. This must have come as quite a blow to the German pilots, who were led to believe that Fighter Command was on its knees. Frustrated, Goering decided that the RAF fighter force had to be brought into battle more quickly. Winter was fast approaching, and the invasion plan required fair weather. He decided that London was a target fighter command daren't leave undefended. Turning his attention from bombing the fighter airfields to the bombing of London was Goering's biggest mistake. Hitler had already decided that London was now a legitimate target. In response to a lone German bomber that had lost its way and dropped its bombs on the city of London, Churchill had ordered reprisal bombings of Berlin. "81 RAF bombers had descended upon Berlin on the night of the 25th of August, causing more civilian casualties. Hitler was furious, and in such willful circumstances, the scene was set for the Great Blitz of London. On the 7th of September, a dense swarm of German planes blackened the London skyline. Nearly 1,000 aircraft, a third of them bombers, filling an area 2 miles high and 800 miles square, sent Londoners scurrying for their air raid shelters. The bombs fell, and London was ablaze. .501 Squadron was quickly moved to Kenley, from where it could more effectively intercept the enemy raids on the capital. This was to be the busiest phase of the battle for the pilots of 501, who flew over 600 hours in September alone.
I saw 109 diving vertically. I went after it and gave it a burst, and it blew up into little pieces. I've never explained what happened. It must have been carrying a bomb which I triggered or something. That's all I can imagine. And covered me in oil. I could even see through the windscreen.
The main incident I can remember actually is doing a head-on attack on some Dornier bombers who were coming in and having my sump of the Hurricane shot away. Completely shot away. The aircraft went into flames, and over the side I went, landing in the guards depot at Caterham.
And I looked over my left shoulder, and there was an aircraft coming towards me from slightly above, very fast. And I thought, that's my number 3 coming to join up formation. He's coming much too fast, he's going to overshoot me. Then my next thought was, it's not a Hurricane, had a big, round, yellow propeller boss with a big hole in it for firing cannon through. My next thought was, he's going to fire at me any minute now. He was only about 100, 150 yards from me by then. All these thoughts, of course, went through very quickly. And so I pulled hard round to the left towards him, pulled the stick hard back into my tummy, and did a very steep turn just as he fired his guns. And a cannon shell went through my starboard wing, leaving a jagged hole in it, I suppose about 2 feet from where I was sitting.
501 had a new arrival who was soon to make his mark on the squadron. By his own admission, Pilot Officer Ken Mackenzie had been champing at the bit to get into the thick of the action.
I came up below a swarm, as they used to call them, of 8 German aircraft with a Weaver. So I attacked the Weaver as he came across and hit him. straight away, but ran out of ammunition. But having hit him, he rolled over and went down and back towards the coast, and I rolled after him and followed him, and we were coming down to about 200 or 300 feet over Folkestone Harbour, and he was aiming to get back over the channel actually, and I was able to form mate on him and thought, how can I put him down? And I thought if I put my undercarriage down, I might be able to take his tail fin off with the undercarriage. When I put my undercarriage on, of course it reduced my speed also, and that was no good. But as I put the undercarriage up, mated on him again, and brought my starboard wing tip down onto his port tail plane. We were about 100 feet off the sea actually, and his port tail plane broke off. He went straight in, and I had about 3.5 feet broke off the end of my starboard wing actually.
Mackenzie was quickly set upon by 2 more 109s, but he somehow maintained control of his stricken plane and managed to bellyland near Folkestone, cutting open his lower lip and knocking out 4 teeth in the process. On the 15th of September, Londoners had looked up to their skies and seen nearly 200 Spitfires and Hurricanes engaging the enemy in combat. It was the climax of the daylight battles, what would later become known as Battle of Britain Day. On this momentous day, 501 managed to claim 6 enemy aircraft while losing 2 of its own and 1 pilot. The concentration of RAF fighters that they encountered over London that day finally convinced the Germans that fighter command was far from depleted. Fighter command did not gain control of the skies over Britain. The German air fleets would continue their raids for a long while yet, and London would endure 76 consecutive nights of bombing. But nothing short of German command of the air could provide the security necessary for a seaborne invasion. Just by remaining intact, fighter command had won a famous victory. It had won the Battle of Britain. Goering's Luftwaffe had played and lost. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely, and Hitler turned his attention to the east and Russia. The Luftwaffe had shown devastating suitability during the blitzkriegs of the continent for which it had been originally designed, but failed to follow any coherent strategy for any length of time during the Battle of Britain. Dowding and Park, on the other hand, had shown masterly command of their aircraft. Inexplicably, the reward for their efforts from the RAF High Command was swift and calculated dismissal from their jobs immediately after the battle. The real heroes of the battle, though, remain those men who took to the skies against all odds, risking their lives day after day, and who will forever be known as the few. On the 17th of December, the 17 Hurricanes of Auxiliary Air Force Squadron 501 returned to their home base of Filton. The 149 enemy aircraft that the pilots of Fighting 501 had shot down since it started operations in July had come at enormous cost.